If working harder was the answer, then why are so many hardworking people still stuck in the same place? Ethan Carter asked himself that question more times than he could count, especially on nights when his desk lamp was the only light still on in his small bedroom, long after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep. Because no matter how many hours he studied, no matter how early he woke up at 5 a.m., no matter how many times he told himself to push just a little further, the results never seemed to change. And that was the part that hurt the most, not the effort, but the feeling that his effort meant nothing. Every test came back the same, average scores. Every competition ended the same. Someone else winning, someone else being praised, someone else being called talented. And there was always that one name that kept showing up at the top, Lucas, the kid who seemed to understand everything without even trying. The one who could finish his work in half the time and still have the confidence to smile like it was easy. And Ethan hated that feeling, not because he wanted to bring Lucas down, but because deep inside, he started to believe something dangerous. Maybe I'm just not like him. Maybe I don't have what it takes. And that thought followed him everywhere, from the classroom to the dinner table, to the quiet moments when he stared at his reflection and wondered what he was missing. Because from the outside, Ethan looked like someone who should succeed. He showed up. He worked hard. He never gave up. But inside, something was breaking slowly, something that no one else could see. And the more he tried to fix it by doing more, by pushing harder, by sacrificing sleep and comfort, the worse it seemed to get. Until one evening, after getting another disappointing result, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the paper in his hands. And for the first time, the thought didn't feel like a question anymore. It felt like the truth. Maybe I'm just not meant to succeed. And in that quiet moment, without realizing it, Ethan wasn't just losing a test. He was starting to lose belief in himself. And what he didn't know yet was that this exact moment, this quiet, painful realization, was about to lead him to a lesson that would completely change the way he understood success forever. The next morning felt heavier than usual, not because anything around Ethan had changed, but because something inside him had. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the same urgency to try harder. Instead, he felt tired in a way that sleep could not fix, as if all the effort he had been putting in was slowly draining something deeper than energy. And as he walked into school, he noticed how everything seemed the same classrooms, the same teachers, the same students, and of course, the same results waiting at the end of the day. Lucas was already there, laughing with a group of friends, relaxed as always, and Ethan could not help but watch him for a moment, wondering how someone could carry success so easily while he struggled just to keep up. During class, Ethan tried to focus. He opened his notebook, listened carefully, wrote everything down, just like he always did. But this time, there was a small voice in his mind that kept whispering, "What is the point? You have done all of this before, and it never changed anything." And that voice made every minute feel longer, every effort feel heavier, until even the simplest tasks started to feel like a burden. After school, instead of rushing home to study like he usually did, Ethan walked slowly, taking longer steps, delaying the moment he would have to sit at his desk again, because he already knew what it would feel like. The same cycle, the same frustration, the same quiet disappointment. And when he finally got home, he dropped his backpack by the door and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. His father noticed immediately, not just the silence, but the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that meant something was wrong beneath the surface. He sat down across from Ethan and waited for a moment before speaking, giving him space, and then gently asked, "Long day?" Ethan nodded without looking up. His father studied his face for a second and then asked another question. "Did you try your best?" Ethan hesitated, because for the first time, he did not know how to answer that. He had always said yes before, always believed it. But now something felt off, as if trying his best was no longer enough. Or maybe it never was. "I do not know," Ethan finally said quietly, and that answer was enough for his father to understand that this was not about a single bad result. This was something deeper, something that had been building over time. So instead of giving advice right away, instead of telling him to work harder or stay positive, his father leaned back and said something unexpected. "Tomorrow, do not study more. Just do exactly what you have been doing, nothing extra, nothing less." Ethan looked up, confused, because it sounded like the opposite of what he needed. But his father simply smiled and added, "I want you to see something first, because sometimes the problem is not how hard you work, it is how you think about the work itself." And in that moment, Ethan did not fully understand what his father meant, but something about the calm confidence in his voice made him pause, as if for the first time, there might be an answer that did not involve pushing himself harder, but instead, seeing something he had been missing all along. The next day, Ethan did exactly what his father told him to do, nothing more and nothing less. And at first, it felt strange, almost uncomfortable, because he was so used to pushing himself beyond his limits, adding extra hours, repeating the same problems over and over again, believing that more effort would eventually lead to better results. But this time, he stopped when he was supposed to stop. He followed the same routine, the same study plan, the same notes, and for the rest of the evening, he simply sat there, thinking, and that was when he started to notice something he had never paid attention to before. It was not the amount of work that was exhausting him. It was the way he was doing it. Because as he replayed his study sessions in his mind, he realized that most of the time, he was not truly focused. He was rushing, trying to finish faster, trying to cover more material, trying to keep up with an image of what hard work should look like, instead of actually understanding what he was learning. And that realization made him uncomfortable, because it meant that all the extra hours he had been sacrificing were not as effective as he believed. Later that evening, his father came home and found Ethan sitting quietly at the table, not studying, not distracted, just thinking, and without asking too many questions, he pulled out a chair and sat down beside him. "So, what did you notice?" he asked calmly. Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. "I think I have been doing a lot, but not really learning." His father nodded slightly, as if he had been waiting for that exact answer. And then he said something that Ethan would not forget. "Working hard is not about how many hours you put in. It is about how much you improve in those hours." Ethan looked at him, trying to fully understand what that meant, and his father continued, "If you spend 3 hours repeating the same mistake, that is not hard work. That is just wasted time. Real hard work is when you slow down, find your mistake, and fix it, even if it takes longer, even if it feels uncomfortable, because improvement does not come from doing more, it comes from doing better." And for the first time, Ethan felt like he was hearing something real, something that explained why all his effort had not been working. It was not that he lacked discipline. It was not that he lacked effort. It was that he had never learned how to direct it properly. And that night, instead of forcing himself to study more, Ethan made a quiet decision. "Tomorrow, I will not try to do more. I will try to understand more." And although it sounded simple, it felt like a completely different approach, something new, something uncertain, but also something that gave him a small sense of control again. And as he went to bed that night, for the first time in a long time, he was not thinking about how far behind he was. He was thinking about how he could finally start moving forward, one step at a time. The next morning, Ethan woke up at the same time as always, but something felt different, not because the world had changed, but because his approach had. And as he sat at his desk, he resisted the urge to rush, resisted the habit of trying to cover as much material as possible, and instead, he opened his notebook and chose just one topic, something he had struggled with before. And for the first time, he slowed down. He read each line carefully. He asked himself simple questions. Why does this work? What does this step mean? What am I missing here? And at first, it felt frustrating, because slowing down made him realize how many gaps he had, how many things he thought he understood but actually did not. And there were moments when he wanted to go back to his old way, to move faster, to feel productive again. But he remembered what his father said. Improvement does not come from doing more. It comes from doing better. So he stayed with the discomfort. He stayed with the confusion. And instead of avoiding mistakes, he started to face them directly, writing them down, correcting them, and trying again. And something small but important began to happen. He started to understand, not perfectly, not all at once, but in small pieces, like putting together a puzzle one part at a time. And later that day at school, when the teacher explained a similar problem, Ethan noticed something he had never experienced before. He could follow along, not because he memorized the steps, but because he actually understood the reason behind them. And that feeling was different from anything he had felt before. It was not excitement. It was not relief. It was something quieter, something more stable. It was confidence, not the loud kind, but the kind that grows slowly, built on real understanding. And as the days passed, Ethan continued this new approach. He did not increase his hours. He did not push himself to exhaustion. Instead, he focused on being present, on learning deeply, on fixing one mistake at a time. And while the progress was not immediate, while there were still moments of doubt and frustration, there was also something new, something that had been missing before, a sense of direction, because now, every small improvement felt real. Every corrected mistake felt like a step forward, and even though Lucas was still ahead, still performing at a high level, Ethan no longer felt the same pressure to compare, because for the first time, he was not chasing someone else's results. He was building his own path, slowly, steadily, and without realizing it. Ethan had already begun to change, not into someone different, but into someone who finally understood what real effort looked like. And that understanding was quietly setting the foundation for something much bigger than he could see at that moment. As the weeks passed, Ethan continued with his new approach, and while nothing dramatic happened at first, something subtle began to shift, the kind of change that is easy to miss if you are only looking for big results. Because his scores were not suddenly perfect, and he was not at the top of the class, but there was a difference, a clear difference, one that even he could not ignore anymore. The mistakes he used to repeat started to disappear, the confusion that once slowed him down began to fade, and the questions that used to frustrate him now felt like challenges he could actually face. And that small sense of progress gave him something he had been missing for a long time. Momentum, not the kind that pushes you forward quickly, but the kind that keeps you moving, step by step, without stopping. And one afternoon, during a class review session, something unexpected happened. The teacher asked a question, one that most students hesitated to answer, and before Ethan even realized it, his hand was already raised. For a brief moment, he felt the same old doubt, trying to pull him back, but this time, it was weaker, because he knew he understood the concept, not perfectly, but enough to try. And when he spoke, his answer was not just correct, it was clear, and for the first time, the teacher nodded with genuine approval. And that moment, simple as it seemed, stayed with Ethan long after the class ended, because it was not about being right. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of understanding, capable of improving, capable of growing. And later that day, as he walked home, he thought about how different this felt compared to before, when he used to chase results. Now he was building something deeper, something that did not disappear after a single test. And when he arrived home, his father noticed the change immediately, not in his words, but in the way he carried himself, calmer, more certain. So, his father asked, "What changed?" Ethan paused for a moment, and then said, "I think I finally understand what you meant. I was working hard before, but I was not really improving." His father smiled slightly and replied, "Most people confuse effort with progress. They think doing more means becoming better, but real progress comes from understanding your mistakes and fixing them." And Ethan nodded, because now, those words were no longer just advice. They were something he had experienced himself, and that realization made him look at everything differently, not just school, but effort itself. Because now he understood that working hard was not about exhausting yourself. It was about being intentional, about being patient, about being willing to stay in the uncomfortable space where growth actually happens. And as he sat down at his desk that evening, Ethan no longer felt the pressure to prove himself. He felt something else, something quieter but stronger, a sense of control over his own progress. And although he was still far from where he wanted to be, for the first time, he was no longer afraid of the distance, because now he knew exactly how to close it. 1 week later, something happened that would quietly test everything Ethan had been learning. The school announced an upcoming exam, not just any test, but one that would count heavily toward their final evaluation. And as soon as the announcement was made, the entire class reacted the same way. Stress, pressure, long study plans, and late nights were already being discussed, and Ethan felt that familiar tension rise inside him again. The urge to go back to his old habits, to study longer, to push harder, to try and outwork everyone else. But this time, he paused, because he knew where that path had led him before, and instead of reacting out of fear, he took a step back and asked himself a different question, not how much can I do, but what do I actually need to improve? And that small shift changed everything. That evening, while others were planning to stay Up for hours, Ethan sat down and reviewed his notes carefully, not rushing, not trying to cover everything at once, but focusing on the areas where he still felt unsure. He identified his weak points, wrote them down, and created a simple plan, one step at a time, one concept at a time. And as the days leading up to the exam passed, Ethan stayed consistent. He did not increase his hours dramatically. He did not sacrifice his sleep. He woke up at the same time, studied with the same focus, and, most importantly, he kept correcting his mistakes. Each time he got something wrong, he did not ignore it. He did not move on quickly. He stopped, understood it, and made sure he would not repeat it again. And there were moments when doubt returned, especially when he saw others studying longer, talking about how many chapters they had finished, how many practice tests they had completed, and for a brief second, he questioned himself, am I doing enough? But then he remembered the difference between effort and improvement, and instead of comparing his workload, he focused on his progress, and slowly, that doubt lost its power. The night before the exam, something felt different, not because Ethan felt completely confident, but because he felt prepared in a way he never had before. There was no panic, no last-minute cramming, just a quiet sense of readiness. And when the day of the exam finally arrived, Ethan walked into the classroom with a calm mind. As the test began, he read each question carefully, taking his time, applying what he had truly understood. And even when he encountered difficult problems, he did not freeze. He broke them down, step by step, just like he had practiced. And for the first time, the exam did not feel like a battle. It felt like a challenge he could handle. And as he put his pencil down at the end, Ethan did not know exactly what his score would be. But he knew something had changed, because this time, he had not relied on luck. He had relied on understanding. And that made all the difference. The next few days felt longer than usual, not because of the work, but because of the waiting, as Ethan sat in class, listening to the teacher go through new material. There was a quiet tension in the air. Everyone knew the results would be announced soon. And for many students, it was just another test, another number. But for Ethan, it felt different, not because he expected to suddenly be the best, but because this time, the result would mean something deeper. It would reflect not just how much he studied, but how much he had changed. And when the teacher finally walked in holding the stack of graded papers, the room fell silent. One by one, names were called, papers were handed out, reactions followed, some smiles, some disappointment. And then, Ethan heard his name. He walked up calmly, took the paper, and returned to his seat without rushing to look at it. For a moment, he just sat there, holding it, as if he already understood that whatever number was on that page, it was not going to define him the way it used to. And when he finally turned it over, he paused, not because it was perfect, not because it was the highest score in the class, but because it was higher than anything he had achieved before, noticeably higher, enough to prove something important. He had improved, and that realization hit differently than any result he had ever received. It was not excitement. It was not relief. It was something deeper, something more stable. It was belief, not in talent, not in luck, but in the process he had started to trust. And as he looked around the room, he noticed Lucas sitting a few seats away, still at the top as expected, still performing with the same confidence. But this time, Ethan did not feel that familiar weight of comparison. He did not feel behind, because for the first time, he understood something clearly. Success was not about beating someone else. It was about becoming better than who you were yesterday. And later that day, as he walked home, the number on the paper mattered less and less. What stayed with him was the proof that change was possible, that effort, when directed the right way, could actually lead somewhere. And when he reached home, his father was waiting, not with questions, but with quiet curiosity. Ethan handed him the paper, and his father looked at it, nodded, and then looked back at Ethan, not with surprise, but with a calm understanding, as if this result was expected, not because of talent, but because of the way Ethan had started to think. You see it now, do you not? His father said softly, and Ethan nodded, because now he did not just understand it in theory, he had experienced it himself, the difference between working hard and working right. And as he sat down that evening, something had shifted permanently. The fear of failure was no longer the thing driving him. It was replaced by something else, something stronger, a quiet confidence that as long as he continued on this path, improvement was no longer a question. It was only a matter of time in the days that followed. Something deeper began to take shape inside Ethan, not just in the way he studied, but in the way he saw himself. Because before, every mistake felt like proof that he was not good enough. Every failure felt like a sign to stop. But now, those same moments started to feel different. They became signals, not of weakness, but of direction, telling him exactly where he needed to grow. And instead of avoiding them, he started to look for them, almost as if each mistake was a step forward rather than a setback. And this shift changed the way he approached everything, not just school, but even small daily tasks. When something felt difficult, he no longer asked, "Why is this so hard for me?" He asked, "What can this teach me?" And that question alone gave him control over situations that used to frustrate him. One afternoon, as he sat in class working through a new topic, he noticed something unusual. The problems that once seemed overwhelming now felt manageable, not easy, but possible. And even when he got stuck, he did not feel the same pressure to get it right immediately. He trusted the process, knowing that understanding would come if he stayed with it long enough. And that patience was something he never had before, because earlier, his focus was always on the result, on finishing, on proving himself. But now, his focus had shifted to the process itself, and that made every step feel meaningful, even the slow ones, even the difficult ones. And as weeks turned into months, Ethan's progress became more visible, not just to himself, but to others as well. Teachers began to notice his consistency, his willingness to engage, his ability to explain concepts clearly, and even his classmates started to see him differently, not as someone who struggled, but as someone who was steadily improving. And one day, something unexpected happened. A classmate approached him after school and asked for help with a problem, and for a moment, Ethan hesitated, remembering how he used to be the one asking for help, the one feeling lost. But this time, he nodded, sat down, and carefully explained the concept, step by step, just as he had learned to do for himself. And as he spoke, he realized something important. He was no longer just learning, he was understanding deeply enough to teach. And that realization changed the way he saw his own journey, because now, success was not something distant or unreachable. It was something he was already building, piece by piece, day by day, through small, consistent effort. And as he walked home that evening, Ethan felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not pressure, not doubt, but a quiet sense of purpose, because now he understood that growth was not about sudden breakthroughs. It was about steady progress. And that understanding was turning him into someone stronger than he had ever imagined as time passed. Ethan no longer counted his progress in grades or rankings, but in something far more meaningful: the way he approached challenges, the way he responded to difficulty, and most importantly, the way he saw himself. Because the biggest change was not in his results, it was in his identity. He was no longer the student who doubted his ability every time things became hard. He was no longer the one who believed that success belonged only to the naturally talented. Instead, he had become someone who understood that growth was a process, one that required patience, awareness, and consistent effort in the right direction. And one evening, as he sat at his desk reviewing his notes, his father walked in and quietly observed him for a moment. There was no rush, no frustration, just focus, steady and calm. And after a while, his father asked a simple question: "What do you think is different now?" Ethan paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because he wanted to express it clearly. "I used to think success was about working harder than everyone else," he said slowly, "but now I see that it is about working the right way, understanding what you are doing, fixing your mistakes, and staying consistent. Even when it feels slow." His father smiled, not surprised, but satisfied, because that was the lesson he had hoped Ethan would discover on his own. And then he added something that stayed with Ethan long after that moment. "Anyone can work hard for a day, or even a week, but very few people are willing to work the right way for a long time. That is what makes the difference." And Ethan nodded, because now he understood that real effort was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, disciplined, and often invisible to others. But it was also powerful, because it built something that could not be taken away. And as the months went by, Ethan continued on this path, not chasing perfection, not comparing himself to others, but focusing on steady improvement. And while he eventually achieved better results, earned recognition, and gained confidence, Those things no longer defined his journey. They were simply byproducts of the process he had learned to trust, and deep down, Ethan knew that the most important thing he had gained was not success itself, but the understanding of how to reach it. Because once you truly understand how progress works, you are no longer afraid of failure, you are no longer dependent on talent, and you are no longer limited by doubt. You become someone who can grow, no matter where you start, and that is what truly changes everything.